Okay, I'm Jennifer Contreras, and the claim I'm responding to is that non-regulation of over-the-counter drugs containing DXM can cause death. My opponent's secondary claims were the sale of OTC drugs without prescription is dangerous. People use OTC drugs, which is over-the-counter drugs, as a replacement for illegal drugs. And number 3, over-the-counter drugs can be addictive. Okay. My response to the secondary claim, number 1, is the sales of over-the-counter drugs without prescription are beneficial and not dangerous. My first evidence challenge is my opponent argued that non-regulation of drugs causes repetition and the consumption can lead to health problems. But in fact, consumption of over-the-counter drugs does not lead to health problems. According to the FDA, over-the-counter products either meet the FDA standards or pass the requirements of an over-the-counter monograph. Therefore, they don't lead to health problems as long as they are properly consumed and managed with the instructions on the drug label. Now, reasoning challenges. My opponent reasoned that over-the-counter drugs are dangerous and can lead to health problems, but in fact, his reasonings undermines his claim because not taking over-the-counter drugs will lead to more serious and dangerous health problems. Now, my first counterclaim. According to a study of Schneider in 2010, out of 300 mothers, more than 90% kept some over-the-counter medication to prevent minor illnesses from becoming a dangerous health problem. Therefore, this contradicts my advocate's point because if over-the-counter drugs were that dangerous, then there would not be such a high percentage of consumers still purchasing them. Now, the second claim I'm responding to is he stated that people use over-the-counter drugs as a replacement for illegal drugs, but my claim is people use generic over-the-counter drugs as a replacement for expensive name brand drugs. My first evidence challenge is my opponent argued that one teen in every 10 has reported abuse of cough medicine to get high, but in fact, my opponent never states if this statistic is just a sample size of the population or the whole population. Therefore, this undermines his claim because it doesn't state if this statistic was large enough to have relevant significance. Now, reasoning challenges. My opponent reasoned that over-the-counter drugs are being abused when taken by the consumer without being sick. But in fact, the consumer the consumer is recommended to take over-the-counter medication without being sick for conditions which require prompt treatment, such as a headache. According to the Consumer Health Care Products Association Clinical Committee, professional treatment guidelines recommend the early use of over-the-counter medicine to maximize the effectiveness for treatment of a headache. Now, counterclaims. My opponent stated that people use over-the-counter drugs as a replacement for illegal drugs, but in fact, people use over-the-counter drugs as a replacement for expensive name brand drugs. According to Neil Widger, who was the author of Guide to Over-the-Counter Drugs, the average price of an over-the-counter drug is less than between $10, whereas a prescribed brand is double or even triple the cost. Therefore, the consumers not only save on drug costs, they also save on out-of-the-pocket expenses for doctor visits and transportation, as well as time spent traveling and waiting at the doctor's office. Okay, now my third response to one of the secondary claims is over-the-counter. Well, he stated that over-the-counter drugs can be addictive, but my claim is over-the-counter drugs are not addictive. Over-the-counter drugs are not addictive. They are just not used if they are not used safely. Okay, so my first evidence challenge is my opponent argued that over-the-counter drugs can be addictive, but in fact, over-the-counter drugs are not addictive if taken properly and safely at the recommended dosage. According to the FDA, all over-the-counter medicines must have standardized labels that provide instructions for safe and effective use. And now for reasoning challenges. My opponent stated that in the past 2 years, hospital reported dozens of overdose, including 5 deaths, where the abuse of over-the-counter medicines was a factor. However, my opponent states that if the factor didn't state that if this over-the-counter was the factor for the determinant death. Now, lastly, for the counterclaim, my opponent reasoned that over-the-counter drugs can be addictive when taken repeatedly, but in fact, in a study performed on 1,000 Americans, according to Schneider, they found that 90 to 95% of consumers read the drug fact label on over-the-counter medicines, but also found that consumers, pretty much, that 90 to 95% of over-the-counter consumers read the labels. And yeah, so.
All right, Jennifer, I think you started off pretty well labeling the claims, and we should be able to get the structure, and you do a good job signposting as you go along, but there are a couple of things that are problematic. First of all, you did that thing that I told people not to do, and I don't know if you missed class that day or you just forgot, but you don't need to tell us, here's an evidence challenge, here's a reasoning challenge, here's a counterclaim. Just make your claims, because it over-organizes your points. And often the things that you're presenting as arguments in those categories don't really fit in those categories. And if they don't fit in the categories, then that would be something that draws attention to your argument, whereas the claim might apply to the argument. If you just made the claim, then nobody's going to worry about what category it fits in. So you guys don't overdo that. I think that just makes it more complicated than necessary. I think the biggest problem here is that you're not looking at the context in which the advocate's argument exists. You're talking about whether or not over-the-counter drugs might be generically unsafe for people to use, when the advocate is really talking about people abusing the use of these over-the-counter drugs. And I think that your arguments, address a separate issue for the most part. They're talking about the fact that people keep them for good purposes, and they know what they're doing when they use them, and they are helpful in preventing diseases. Those are all good reasons why people would want to have access to over-the-counter drugs, but it doesn't answer the fact that your teenage son is, choking down cough syrup to get high at lunchtime. And those are the kinds of things that the advocate was talking about. Which, by the way, I'm not sure there's an argument there, but that should have been one of your points, that that's not real. Nobody disputes that those things happen. The question is, why do those things happen? Do they happen because it's unregulated, or do they happen because people are stupid, And the truth of the matter is, nobody's going to dispute that people are stupid. The world is full of stupid people. All right? So like I said, I like the organization. I kind of like the generic responses that you've got, but too often, like I said, they seem to miss the crux of the argument. All right, thank you.